agenda is the establishment of a development authority, and I will move the staff recommendation. Do I have a seconder? Yep. Seconded Jamie Goff. I believe that we have some staff available to provide advice on this. Do we? Yes. Right. Mike Teelan and Peter Gudsall. Right, are there any questions that people have? Glenn.
Thank you. Very supportive of this. We need to do this. I just need to reconcile in my own mind a key part of this proposal, and I've had a good discussion with some about this in relation to procurement there. Just with the OAG guidelines, one part says even if the agent, which this is proposed to be, is from the private sector, when acting for a public entity, they must meet the same standards of good procurement practice that apply to the public entity. So quite happy to get behind this. I'm just, I need some reassurance over how we can get this to meet up, and I guess this comes down to proximity of this proposed entity from the main public body. So if I could have a response on that, that would be good.
Okay, so my understanding around the OAG guidelines are any entity that is 50% or more owned by a public entity will also have to abide by the Office of the Auditor General procurement guidelines. So if we're going to have a private sector entity, obviously doesn't have to abide by those, and the definition and line between those is if it's less than 50% ownership. So that should clarify when it has to be, when it has to follow normal guidelines.
So obviously the way it's structured up, key to it, and it has governance ramifications, as we know.
So what will be important will be the form and architecture of a development authority as requested and agreed by councillors. That will determine the form of that structure, and also then the procurement model that would need to be followed.
Thank you very much for the report. Look, I just want to, you're being very specific in 7.2 about the areas that the future advice we would be informed on. One other area, or one, perhaps it's an overarching one too, in terms of the architecture, but it's also just how, in fact, would council have a mandate for what the authority would actually produce in terms of the projects? How would we as council be able to do that?
I think that's incumbent in, I suppose, the structure that you finally choose to set up to do that. And depending again on the degree of ownership, whether you do that by statement of intent to a board, or whether you do that by direct attendance on a board and that board member reporting back to council. I think those, you've got that choice to work through those parameters, and clearly that's an area that we will be reporting back to council on, with some options around that.
Thank you, Mike.
Jimmy Chen.
Thank you. One question. I reviewed the staff the information 7.2, and compared to the 1.2, and also compared to the 2.4. We request if the CEO, provide urgent advice at the end of January next year. But those items is kind of quite different. I'm not sure what's the rationale. Which one is kind of, your real the recommendation? For instance, like 1.2, your particular mention is legal form, mandate, function, governance, accountability. But in here, it's focused on the decision-making framework, strategic direction, or operational scope. There's also different terms.
I think that's just a little bit of different language coming through. Obviously, 7.2 are the resolutions. I mean, I think it's also noting that it's not necessarily limited to that. So, in fact, I think what we were trying to do in 7.2 is reflect the key things that council wanted to have a look at. Where, I mean, I think broadly we will be reporting back on all those matters that are canvassed in 1.2 as well.
Thank you. Yanni.
Thank you. I just wanted to check in with you over 2.4. I know I have raised this with the Chief Executive, and we've had an email back around the idea that we fast-track things by using private sector procurement and performance delivery approaches. So just in a really simple way, can you just tell me what the difference is between the private sector procurement versus what the public sector procurement would be, and what the different performance delivery approaches are between the two?
It's probably easier to explain the public sector requirements, which is in the answer to Councillor Livingstone, guided by the OAG guidelines, and the guidelines then enacted at a policy level with the organisation's procurement policy. The principles for public sector procurement are consistent across public entities and are based around transparency, fairness to market, competitiveness, and so forth. Private entities, while they may have some guidelines and policies, aren't bound by the same OAG guidelines.
There's still the second part around what the performance, how the performance delivery approaches differ, but just on this particular point, why would we want to get away from being transparent, having fairness to market, and public accountability of public funding, given that this is generally around public facilities?
I haven't said we want to get away from it. I've simply said that a private entity may or may not choose to follow the OAG guidelines. A public entity is required to follow the guidelines, so they're not overly prescriptive. A private entity can follow those exact same guidelines. So you could establish a private entity and it could have exactly the same procurement approaches in terms of a procurement policy as a public entity, but that is a choice that the private entity would make.
So is that, given that the assumption under 2.4 that the reason for this is to use private sector procurement, and some of us may feel concerned about that, how can we more adequately address that before we agree to it in principle? Can we agree to principle that it should be set up established with public procurement as being the key basis for it?
Well, I think that's a choice for council, but I think that would probably be premature for council, because it's not simply around the procurement. Obviously, it's around procurement as part of the value chain in there, but equally things like being able to build strategic alliances, being able to perhaps deliver things through a variety of models under that framework, whether that be alliance models or JV models, may all need to be considered as part of that. So I think probably the answer to your question, Councillor Hanson, is that really that is part of the debate that probably needs to come in January, and I think some of the advice that you'll want to see coming back from staff are the pros and cons around whatever procurement and legal structures put in place.
Ali?
Thank you. 5.5 on page 7 leading on to 8 outlines the advantages and risks. Could you just in really simple, easy to understand terms outline what, in your opinion, Christchurch stands to lose if we don't have a DA such as this?
That's probably quite a challenging question. I think, in some respects, what this is around, if you look at the genesis of this, is around, I suppose, what we may lose is opportunity. So really if you look in section 2 where it says what are some of the challenges, it's the challenges that we face around actually getting the market moving, and there are a number of both institutional and market barriers to getting the market moving. There are those opportunities to do things that are outside the normal scope of what council may have done and to look for different vehicles. So I think this is about trying to broaden the way in which we can receive and maximise opportunity in the marketplace. and it's around ensuring that we have very flexible structures to do that.
And speeding things up. And
speed and agility to respond to that is clearly one of those, but it's only one dimension in that equation.
Thank you.
Pauline?
I've actually got two questions, if I may. For this to work, I believe it would have to be distanced from council to a certain extent and independent. And so would it then still be possible to have elected members on the board?
Well, I think again that comes down to the choice that council wishes to make. I think if you look at the spectrum, I think some of the advice is the more distinct this is as an organisation, provided it's got a very clear direction from council, the more it is able to operate perhaps in the way that questions of agility and speed and opportunity are.
Yeah.
I mean, I think council will need to decide ultimately where it wishes to sit on that spectrum.
Yeah.
But equally, it needs to know that where it chooses to sit in the governance spectrum will also influence what it can choose to do in the performance spectrum.
Okay, so that's to be determined.
Yeah.
And regarding CDC, I had a lot of questions from people. How does this fit with the CDC, or why isn't this sitting in CDC, where their mandate is leading economic development for the city of Christchurch? So it'd be quite good to get an explanation around that. So why we need something else and why that can't sit in there.
Well, at the moment, our current level of service of CDC is largely threefold. It's largely around economic policy advice. There is some work that they've traditionally done in the startup business area, and historically they used to do some work in some youth employment. So again, it would be a case of saying, actually, do you wish to change the mandate and the fundamental relationship you have with CDC? Again, it's a body that, while it has its own board, it reports through CCHL. I think the model around a DA is perhaps a more operationally focused activity than what CDC currently provides us. I also think that, again, depending on where this finally falls, some of the models we've seen around development agencies or authorities worldwide often operate with some additional regulatory authority, or they have some bespoke authority associated with them, particularly where they've had some state backing. That's not what's being suggested here, but that also suggests a measure of separation from the general business of council is probably appropriate.
Right, okay, that's a good answer, thank you.
Andrew?
Given that a number of the questions this afternoon have related to the governance of the entity and also the mandate from council that it would work under, and given that in 1.2 the words governance and mandate are mentioned, I note that they're not mentioned in 7.2. Would it be an idea to put those two words in there so that we can be sure that the reporting back will cover those areas?
That would be perfectly appropriate if you wish to add that, yes.
Yeah, if we could add that by way of amendment, just to add the words governance and mandate into paragraph 7.2, please.
Well, as the mover, I'm happy with that. Are you happy with that, Councillor Goff? Yep. I have a question, which, because in all of the discussions that we've had about this, it has occurred to me that perhaps we should also be reflecting on our own procurement practices. I was surprised to find that 2 months was added to the process, which was really a process to bring the decision back to council. And I wonder whether we should be thinking about streamlining that process at the same time.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
See how streamlined he is?
That was easy. Oh, so should we expect a report on that at the same time?
Well, we've got the report in progress that will come in the new year on the delegations, which will go some way to streamlining this. Somewhat like by virtue of the legislation, there are some requirements that apply to council executing their decision making, and so we're bound by those, but absolutely we should and can speed things up.
Right. So we might be able to operate in a parallel process. The two areas where the governance sign off and the procurement practice.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. Great. Good. That would be a good thing. Excellent. Any other questions? Yanni.
just wanted to check with the report that will come back. Are you going to do a kind of analysis of the current situation, particularly around having the most extraordinary powers by government that the government's ever probably had in New Zealand, having their own development agency and having recovery strategies and an investment office, and why that hasn't worked? I mean, I'm really keen to look at what we can do going forward, but I also want to learn from, given the situation we're in where, even going back to when the blueprint was announced, that it was going to be up to the private sector to come along and fund these projects, and there were mechanisms set up that clearly haven't worked. Things like the Metro Sports Stadium, Convention Centre, we're still kind of waiting and have been delayed, not through public procurement, through council, but through other avenues. So are you going to have any sort of analysis of that in the report that comes back in January?
Yes. He says yes.
And in fact, we've flagged it in the recommendation, particularly taking into account the Crown's current and planned activity in this area.
Yeah.
It's an area in which you've got to take that into account.
Right, okay.
And there has been some work done which has looked at the market performance around the recovery of Christchurch to date, so we'll be looking at that material as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was the whole assumption of the blueprint of how it would be funded would be private sector and council, but it hasn't worked for whatever reason.
Definitely need to look at that.
Can we also make sure when it comes back that we get information about, you've talked about funding implications, but actually the basis for the DA also seems about maximising council's return on investment. So can you come back with some information about what percentage would be acceptable, what the private costs are versus the public costs?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer at a summation level, because it will be dependent on the project and the objectives and the mandate that it's given. So funding overall is very much dependent. If we look at the diagram that we have in the first diagram on 1.3, and where in that matrix council wishes to position their development authority or special vehicles. That will determine the funding, also determine based on the objectives, whether they be social or economic, what the return would be expected for any particular part of that. So it's not one that we can at this stage commit to. It's already looking like a very large piece of work to bring this back in the end of January.
But I just think it's really, sorry, through the chair, really important that, because my understanding previously is the reason that people haven't been lining up to fund stadiums is because actually the return on a stadium is pretty, it's not very good. Actually, it loses a lot of money. So why would the private sector be interested in building a stadium, or, unless there was operational thing? So,
I mean, I understand. I mean, that. Yeah.
Can we get some information back on that?
Well, the point that's being made, I think, by staff is that, I guess that's the political debate, and we can have that when we have the debate. With staff, I think they're making it very clear they're going to take into account the Crown's current and planned activity in this area. That naturally looks at what's been going on. So I'm sure that you'll be satisfied with the report when it comes back. So we've heard what you've had to say, but I don't think that there's any point getting staff to answer what is basically a political question. Pauline?
A quick one. Regarding the report that comes back, how will that be? Will that come back with different models, or what will we get? Because I know I read somewhere something about we could develop more of a broker-focused model, which could be quite attractive since, it'd be a facilitator and perhaps not require so much funding or any funding. So will we see some modelled scenarios, or I'm just not sure?
I would hope that we would come back with a number of scenarios, and it may be that those scenarios are not mutually exclusive. I mean, one of the things that council may do is actually take a fairly broad approach to this, and in some respects it does speak to Councillor Hanson's question that depending on the purpose of each individual engagement, some of them may be commercial, some of them may choose not to be commercial. So again, it's actually ultimately, I think, putting up a range of potential pieces to the jigsaw and saying, actually, which of those do you wish to... Actually, that doesn't work. You need a whole jigsaw. Actually, putting up a number of building blocks and saying, which of those do you wish to use or not use? And I think that, again, that'll be the debate that you as councillors need to have around the table in January.
And if you get the architecture right, you might be able to expand it after it's already established, or bring in further partners once it's already established as well.
Absolutely, yes.
All right, so we'll discuss the motion, debate the motion. Does anyone want to? Yanni?
Thank you. Look, I totally support the need for doing something different than what we currently have in the city at the moment. If you go back to when the blueprint was set up, one of the big questions we asked the government at the time was, how's it going to be funded? And we were reassured that it was all under control, it would happen, it would be sorted. And when the blueprint was announced, we were told that the big items like the convention centre, the Metro Sports and the stadium would be worked out between the council and the private sector. And it just hasn't happened. And it's taken a huge amount of time, and actually we've seen very little progress. So we have to do things differently. And so I am happy to support the idea in principle that we look at how we can set up some sort of authority or vehicle to get things done in a different way, because clearly the current system has failed. So I think it's really important, though, when this comes back, for me, the single most important thing is that openness and transparency is absolutely at the heart of how it is set up and how it is governed. And I don't support getting rid of elected councillors when it comes to public funding being removed from the ongoing looking at what this agency might do. And I think we should be really cautious about further putting things into the private sector because they know best, when actually we can see as many risks in the private sector as we can see in terms of the council. And I can just run you through some of those. We went out to a private-public partnership around a recycling plant, and we got about 2 days' notice as councillors that if we didn't come in and bail it out, we were going to lose recycling in the city. The risk always sits with the city and with the citizens that live in it. And so we have to be really cautious about going into these public-private partnerships because we actually fundamentally always take on the risk. And you just need to look at history of private-public partnerships in Christchurch to see where that occurs. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do things differently, doesn't mean we shouldn't look at a new model to try and look at how things can happen and work together with private developers. But we should always be really clear that the rate of return that we can get as a council is different to what a private sector might want. And that's why I think it's really important when the report comes back, we're really clear about what costs we're adding onto our ratepayers if we're using a private sector model versus going through the public sector model. So I will support one because I do support the idea that we need to do things differently in Christchurch. But I do reserve the right to disagree with that once we get the information back through 7.2. But let's get on, do this work, really look at what the options are with a really true picture of what the risks are, rather than just an assumption that, and I think it does come through in this report, the assumption that the private sector knows best and is less risky than what we might be able to do as a council. So I welcome the looking at our procurement policy in parallel, and if we can actually improve things on our end without the need for this, then maybe that's the way to go.
Phil.
Thank you. Like Yanni, I certainly also support the establishment of the Development Authority in principle, and I'm very pleased we've had opportunity to really flesh out the parts that are going to, how it's all going to be, how the architecture is going to be developed. And because I think as councils all together, we want to have a commitment really from us as council. So in fact, the challenges that we have around the earthquake recovery, that the projects can be fast-tracked, so in fact their delivery can be accelerated. I've also got no doubt that the new Development Authority must be work as a collaborative relationship with Council, so that in fact we have the elected members and the organisation all joined up. I think this is though a really good opportunity for us as a council to address those challenges and the gaps in our recovery, and it's important though as a council that we do this all together. So I would expect that in fact the parts on governance and accountability, that clearly they will line up. There's no doubt in my mind too though that so that the work that this Development Authority, that it mustn't be done at the expense of other council and community projects. And alongside that, though, I think there's great potential, for example, for some community facilities that they be developed potentially through the Development Authority. But this is a case too where I believe that community boards would need to be like the conduit with the community, so that in fact again, council is joined up with the new authority. So I think an example of that would be achieving the actual implementation of the suburban master plans that we have. So overall, I think this is a really good opportunity and certainly support the Development Authority being established in principle.
Thank you. Jimmy?
Yeah, I support the staff recommendation, including the 7.1 as well as 7.2. I'm a bilingual the councillor. The crisis, if translated into the Chinese, there's two words. One is the risk. The other one is opportunity, 危机, which means after earthquake, even we have vulnerable situation. However, give us, it's extraordinary the kind of opportunity. That's very, very important. And also this opportunity not stay in there, remain in there. They will away. So we have to grasp this opportunity, outstanding opportunity. It's very, very the important. If we review the information, we still keep the current the kind of sector and the current regulation probably a little bit difficult to break through. And also we are all aware, nationwide, international, have a potential, very good quality of investor would like to partake of the rebuild and the reconstruction of the Christchurch. My personal recently have two experience. One is the four mayor, we are aware, visit Christchurch. They are all kind of weighty, very important kind of city. Two is our sister city. The one is Lanzhou. They have population 4.4 million the people, even equal to the New Zealand.